this thought on the debate between academia and industry.
Yeah.
I have strong feelings, actually.
There we go.
I think that is one of the worst binary views that we can impose on grad students in general. I think it creates sort of, like you said, talking about this disappointment or failure. I think it creates that sense of, okay, if I would make another choice that's better for me, or where I see that I'm most needed or most valuable, but it doesn't fall into industry and or academia.
Science. Technology. Medicine. Health. These four things make the world go round. Without them, we couldn't exist. This is the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health, answering your questions or finding experts in the field to answer them. Your host is a pharmacist, an award-winning scientist. She leads her own research group and is the founder of King's College London Fight the Fakes. A tad bit on the qualified side. Welcome to Monday Science. Here's your host, Dr. Bahijja Raimi-Abraham.
Welcome back to Monday Science, and today we have Alicia McGeachy. I said it wrong at that point. How are you today?
I'm okay, thank you. It's Alicia McGeachy. I think you did very well for the first time.
Thank you so much. Is it the first time though? No.
As everyone else knows.
This is going to be like, they'll know the truth. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
This is one of the hardest questions to answer. I really have no idea where to begin. So I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Scientific Studies in the Arts here at Northwestern University in Chicago. And in a past life, I would say I'm a proud New Yorker. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. And I actually got my bachelor's in chemistry from Spelman College, which is a historically Black all-women's college in Atlanta, Georgia. And that is sort of where my love for chemistry was birthed. I followed up on that and went over to Northwestern University again, working with Franz Geiger, this time in the Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology. And so that's really where I cemented myself as a chemist, as a scholar in this field. I think that's mostly the answer to the question.
Sounds perfect. I'm always fascinated when I speak to Americans. I have a friend who went to Spelman College, but because in the UK with universities, we don't have either like an all Black or all Asian university. It's just anybody, well, I guess a university where anybody and everybody attends. So I'm always quite fascinated by that experience. And I'm going to probably talk to you about that later on. It's just very interesting. It's completely different to how things are in the UK. But you've shared with us that you started your career journey as studying chemistry as a chemist. So what is chemistry to you?
Chemistry is life, I will say. I think for me, one of the things I tell people most is that chemistry is all around us. But what it means to do chemistry is to constantly question why and how things work, and to sort of seek out answers to these questions. But I think part of why I love chemistry is that it's in literally every aspect of our life. From the things we use on our skin and hair to how we cook and bake, how cars operate, how we generate energy. There are a lot of ways that chemistry impacts our daily life, and so it's fair to say chemistry is life.
I love that. I really agree with you. And so you mentioned you did your B and now you're a postdoc researcher. Tell us about your research and what problem it's trying to solve.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm part of the Center for Scientific Studies in the Arts. So this is a joint collaboration between the Art Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. So I think broadly speaking, the biggest challenge we want to address, or the thing that unifies most of the projects we're undertaking, is that we want to sort of act as stewards of the past, right? We want to figure out how we can preserve and conserve history and culturally important objects for the next generation. The specific goals of the center actually are twofold. One, the first being that we want to provide technical and analytical support to institutions that may not have access to these tools otherwise. But also we're looking to take an objects-based and inspired approach to research. So looking at objects and how they might inform our understanding of how they should be cared for, how they should be stored, how they should be presented, but also taking that knowledge, taking those questions and then broadening them to, explore larger issues that affect not only cultural heritage, but also, more mainstream chemistry challenges as well. So we're hoping to push the front on both art history and, curatorial research and science forward. So it's a twofold problem.
It sounds fascinating. And I think just to me, it's very, very unique and true and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like true interdisciplinary between science and the arts and using that collaboratively for, as you said, pushing things forward. I think it's fantastic. Because when I was reading up about you and your amazing career, your bio, I did find it really interesting that your PhD focused on nonlinear optical spectroscopy and applying this to model systems and nanoscale materials. But then now you're taking this kind of like multi-analytical, multidisciplinary approach to understanding production methods in 18th century English and 19th century American ceramics. I was not expecting that, because I was reading about it, I was like, what? Where are we? So yeah, and it's also important, I think, for people, whether interested in STEM or interested in pursuing an academic career, to understand that there is no one traditional route, and I think too much the narrative can sometimes be, oh, if you did a certain topic for your PhD or your undergrad or whatever, that's what you should stay in. And I think your career and what you're doing now is such a perfect example of how things can flow. And so I guess I just want to understand, how did this transition occur? How did you get here? And why ceramics as well? And also, sorry, I'm asking like all the questions. Apologies for the bombarding, but why ceramics? How did you do this? And also why 18th? I'm like, why did you do this? 18th century English and 19th century American ceramics, everything.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll say, I'm going to be completely honest, and I think that's, what's
appreciated.
Towards the end of my PhD, I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I had this sort of reckoning that, I just need to figure out what's going to happen for me. I had some questions about whether I was interested more in scientific outreach and education, more so than research. And I wasn't quite sure exactly whether I was falling out of love with the research I was doing at the moment, or if it was because I was in the lab. And, it's really hard to disentangle that without perspective, right? So I actually had the good fortune of finding this program at Northwestern. It's called the Graduate Engagement Opportunities Community Practicum. And essentially this allows students to take a quarter-long, so maybe 10-week internship at a community-facing organization. And for me, that meant going to the Museum of Science and Industry here in Chicago. And I was working in their education department. And so that sort of allowed me to see what a career in museum education could be like. And I'll say I particularly was interested in exploring museums because I think they're actually a really interesting way of engaging with the public. There are a lot of different program types, a lot of different opportunities, whether in gallery or in sort of breakout rooms, classrooms, what have you. But I think people are always more interested in seeing, these visual elements, and I think they mean a lot for people and myself as well. But in terms of moving from that internship to now coming into a postdoc position at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, it was actually just...
I'm sorry.
Stop me.
It's just dawned on me that you're at the Met.
I was at the Met. Now
you were at the Met.
Yes.
It's just hit me. I as I said, I read your bio and I was like, yeah, the Met. And then as you're saying it now, I was like, the Met.
Yes.
Capital. I was like, I did know this. And then I'm like, no, the capital M Met.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, amazing. Honestly, it was really a life-changing sort of event. But it was, fortunate because my advisor I discussed openly with him that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I had ideas about things I might want to do. I knew for sure what I did not want to do. And so together we sort of, bounced ideas around about what my future could look like. And I think for him, his original idea was something like science writing, which I considered, but I said, oh, I'm not sure yet. And he'd sent me this email. He forwarded me an email from someone at the Met at that time saying, hey, we have this fellowship opportunity in our department, and we'd love for you to disseminate this information widely to whoever you think might, benefit from it. And I honestly wasn't going to apply. I applied the last day, like 5 minutes before it was due. I said, let me just let me just go through with it. And yeah, it worked out amazingly well for me, I think. I had an amazing time there at the Met. And so in terms of moving towards research goals in this sort of cultural heritage field and how I figured out what I would do, to be honest, I had no idea about what I was going to research. I just knew I wanted to see what the potential was there. I don't have a strong art historical background. I took maybe one class in art history in college and said, okay, got it, ran with that. But I was actually mostly focused at that point or interested in understanding sort of the questions that would pertain most to art of the African diaspora, just because I felt like that wasn't something that was being widely explored. And, I think, in understanding these objects, we can begin to talk more about the evolution of African art, African American art, Black art, and how it fits into the larger conversation, both globally, but here, more specifically in American art. So that was my original plan, but that shifted a lot actually when I got to the Met. So yeah, I think you asked why ceramics. I can jump onto that now.
Yeah, I'm just really enjoying listening to your journey and just fascinated actually. But yeah, why ceramics and then the 18th, I guess it all ties in, doesn't it? Ceramics and comparing 18th century English culture, I guess, to 19th century American, and why those different decades.
Centuries. Yeah. So I'll start because I know you're probably interested in knowing what ceramics are too. But ceramics are typically, I think, defined as something that is either entirely or principally composed of clay and that is heated. So that would include things like porcelain, earthenware, stoneware, but also could include things like cement and brick, and some people may include glass. But in each case, you have something that is transformed by heat. From a historical point of view, these are actually really interesting. Ceramics are interesting because they tell us a lot about how people live. So first of all, they're used for dating extensively. I think, it's well known for a lot of cultures about what forms were popular when, how they were being made at that time. And so that helps you figure out dating when you go to like archaeological sites, for instance. But it also tells you about how people live. So were they making pots for cooking? Were these for storage? Were they made in a specific way? Were they ceremonial? All those things help us to fill in things we have no way of knowing otherwise, right? And then the question of 18th and 19th century ceramics, I'll be honest, I won't say no interest. I had not a lot. Didn't have the appreciation that I should have for the ceramics at that point. And I think that's okay to say.
I think that's also part of the journey, right? You can see something and just think like, why is this important? Then when you delve deeper, and that's the beauty, I think, of research and being able to be immersed in something, is that you then really get to the depths of things and understand why it's important.
Right, absolutely. So this project, I'll start with saying that, the first project, one of the first major projects I was on the 18th century English porcelains from the Chelsea porcelain manufactory. And that was a project inspired by a conservator who I believe at that time had questions about what sort of technologies or what the artistic approach was to developing colored enamels. Enamels are sort of glassy-like materials that go over, in this case, a ceramic body, but their enamels specifically are used for maybe decoration, but they're similar to which might provide some sort of protective coating onto a porcelain body. And so really, I think a lot of projects are born this way, in that curators and conservators who have more of an intimate knowledge of the pieces themselves and the sort of gaps in our understanding of how we think about them or how we care for them, for instance, how we treat them, sort of pose these questions. And, they have more of a global view of the art, and so they're in a position, I think, that's uniquely suited to question it. And so the goal of that project was to understand, first of all, what this factory was doing. How did they know what to do in terms of developing these colored glazes, and how did that change over time? Now, I'll say that in comparison to factories in France and in Germany, the people who were operating in England at the time didn't have the luxury of financial support from, the government, right? This was almost a funded operation, which means that you have to operate in a completely different manner than someone who has, the full financial backing, right? And so you make different choices. So how does that sort of position affect the choices you make? And so the goal was to sort of reconstruct, and I'll say that there is not a lot of information from the factory. They didn't keep notes, don't have recipes.
And sorry, just to clarify, so from the English side, these would have been private private artists, or I'm sorry, artists with private funding, or manufacturers with private funding. So it wasn't part of like the government initiative to manufacture these things. So these are just individuals who've got whatever money they can to make these products.
Essentially, yeah, there were a few projects that were commissioned, by British elites. But broadly speaking, they weren't going to be funded, at least, this is my understanding of art history. They weren't going to be funded by, the government. These were things that were almost more private initiatives. But that being said, it's maybe not one person who's doing the work. It may be a collection of people. But these people valued their work and their contributions, their innovation so much that the practice would have been kept private. So the things you did would have been almost trade secrets. People had no idea. You could be asked to say, make the porcelain body, but then they would only keep you on that particular part of it. Maybe you wouldn't know what the glaze recipe was, because you don't want someone walking off with
the trade secrets, and they probably
all the secrets.
Yeah. And also maybe at that time, I mean, I'm sure they had patents and things like that, but then it probably was still, as it is now, expensive and a very money finance intensive process to even get something protected.
Yeah. So there was one factory in England, I believe, the Bow factory. I think they had taken out 2 patents. But as I recall reading from one of their first patents, it was so bizarre. It was like, we have this material that may or may not be from this other place, that may or may not do this one thing, that may or may not happen this other way. And so it was so, hand wavy. And
it's just crazy, because when you said the Bow factory, I actually remember that. And I just did a quick, because Bow is a place in East London.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they've got like a whole thing in the British Museum. So interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah. I actually came to London, visit last year, or maybe, no, the year before, the summer before, and actually went to where the Chelsea factory would have been. And so these were actually, you can actually follow this progression of this site. They had land deeds that survived. So you can see how it expanded. I mean, imagine someone working in their home, and then they expand to, I think, maybe not a full city block, but, a few homes in the area. Mm-hmm. And so you can map out where the kilns were and how they operate. It's fascinating. I think it's really fascinating. But to get back to ceramic, but then the question of how they connect to 19th century can work. So, I mean, I think, yeah, it's sort of interesting, but then also sobering, I guess is the right. You have this proliferation of people and knowledge, coming from a lot of different places at this time, right? You have Europeans coming to the US looking to settle down. You have now also enslaved Black people here in the US. Right, those are typically the potters recognized for a lot of the wares being produced at the 19th century site, the Edgefield district. And so you have people who are coming from England, who are coming from Germany, who are again settling and bringing along sort of their knowledge of pottery and porcelain technology. But then you also have influences from, the slaves themselves, who may have had some traditions from their homeland that they're carrying over as well. So you start to see this influence of, different people, but all captured in this one place. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about ceramics, is that they preserve so much of the story in the clay. From a chemistry point of view, from a scientific point of view, we can really uncover a lot of the different ways that these influences come together. For instance, like on these Edgefield pieces, these, they really parallel some of this is being used in China at the time too. And so it's the question of how or why did they arrive at this choice or this point? And why did they make these jugs? We don't know. These are things we are speculating on, but, we're hoping that science, chemistry can really help us identify these questions.
That just, as you were saying, is sobering, because it's very easy to hear these 18th century, 19th century, and be like, I wonder how that connects. And then you realize the journey of just things that have happened in history. And then, because as you were talking, I was like, okay, so from just, again, I always say this, please correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, have you been able to, because you were giving your example there of pieces that have clear, maybe like Chinese influence and things like that. So have you been able to identify, let's say, a factory of some sort, or a product that was made in 19th century America that has evidence of some of the work tailing back to a country in Africa, let's say, based on the slave trade movement or anything like that? Have you been able to, is it that level of specificity? And then can you, in theory, then understand why now in the present day, certain techniques are used when it comes to ceramics?
Yeah, that's something we would hope, right? But in terms of these particular pieces, all right, so how to say this? I think we have to consider the fact that a lot of these potters weren't allowed to document practice, right? So at this point, literacy is punishable. There are a few potters who actually inscribe their work. So Dave Drake is one of the best known potters who enslaved, who was enslaved, but he also incised and inscribed his work with poetry. And so this is an interesting idea because, to be so blatant, it's at a time where, it's punishable. And I'm not sure what the dynamics are there. I'm not, again, our history is outside of my scope, but there are things we don't know. And I think this is a challenge with history. A lot of what we do know is sort of speculative because of the fact that it's coming from certain places that are outside of where the work is actually happening. But I think for these particular jugs, so to tell you more, they're pots made in the shapes of faces. So there'll be, your face, like a human face, humanized faces on jugs. And we're not exactly sure why they were made or what their utility was. And so I think what the current speculation is on the West African influence is that the forms of the jugs is the West African influence, as opposed to material choices. But in order for us to identify, answer these questions, which I think it's a really good question. I think we need to have comparable pieces from West Africa at the same time, or, just before, or to compare to, which again requires us to be more diligent in our assessment and study of African art and how that now translates to the things we find here in the US. Yeah.
Amazing. My mind is blown because I was here just wanting to talk about chemistry. How did I did not expect, I was just like, I was not expecting, and please note, this is not in any criticism, but I just wasn't expecting that depth of I have goosebumps right now because it's just, again, going back to your point of chemistry is around us, chemistry is life, and just how your knowledge of just everything that you're doing is connecting. I don't mean to sound cheesy, but it's like connecting time, it's connecting history, it's giving clarity to the present day, which I believe is it's just so powerful. So sorry, I'm really blown away. It's amazing work. I wanted to touch on, sorry, you can tell.
I'm glad
you've got me flabbergasted. I meant to be hosting and being an amazing, interviewer, and I'm like, I'm just so overwhelmed. No, but I wanted to, thank you so much for that insight. And I just looked up David Drake. I've got some reading to do there, and the pieces that you said of people's faces, have you been able to identify who the artists are? Is there something we can look up?
So yes and no. In terms of, so we know that these pieces were, I think, originally being produced in the Edgefield district, so this is in South Carolina, but there's this migration of the technique and these forms out to Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, Georgia, so it's really migrating out from there. So we have, that's sort of one of the overarching goals of the project, is to figure out, how can a chemistry inform our knowledge of how these techniques and forms and the science that went into their production sort of migrated with the people, how those material choices might change depending on your access to materials. So not yet, but we do know a few factories that were operating in the time, but we don't know specific people, slaves. We do, some records may have the names of slaves that were maybe leased out to other sites, but those are not complete records. That's a history. The problem with record keeping is so dependent on the person who's in charge of keeping the record.
Yeah, and also as well, different cultures have different way of transferring history. So there's always this conversation around the European way of transferring history is written. In many African cultures and West Indian cultures, the way to transfer history is oral history. And so if it's not passed on, if the information is not passed on from generations to generations, then you lose that gap in terms of the oral history side of things. So
and that holds too for these factories, these European factories as well. I think this is something you'll have to fact check, and if it's wrong, you can edit it out. But I believe that during the French Revolution, Sèvres, which is another porcelain production company, hid their records in a vault so as to protect them from being destroyed. That level there may or may not have been taken widely. I probably would have considered if I was in charge, but someone thought well enough to say, we need to protect these. These are important.
And they're beautiful. Again, I literally everything you're saying, I'm like, oh, let me just search that because I want to remember everything. I want to talk about because there were so many pockets and gems as you're explaining your journey. And one of the things I like and I'm such an advocate for is being honest with yourself, and sometimes being honest with, well, not sometimes, being honest with the people around you, around where you're at with your career and your feelings about research and PhD life and everything. And you know, I also had that same experience after doing my PhD. I did not want to do anything to do with science, or I just needed a break. I was like, I need to learn to be bored and I just need to switch off. And I like what you said when you're like, you know, you just were sort of done with it all really and needed a break. And then you spoke with your supervisor. And I think it's that thing of, we realize we sometimes people don't realize that mentorship is always around you, and if you have a good mentor, they will listen to your truth and support you within your truth as opposed to tailoring it to what they want. And so I guess that leads me on to my next question, which is what has your postdoc experience been like for you specifically?
So my postdoc has been, I'll say very honestly, incredibly fruitful and rewarding. So as I mentioned, this is now my second postdoc here at Northwestern, but before this I was at the Met. It is a little awkward, I'll say too, that because I started this position here in Chicago, it was March 1st, I believe, was my first official day. March 1st.
2020.
Ooh,
okay.
January, I think February 20th or so is when we got the notice, like, you got to clear all your stuff out because you got to go, the world's shutting down. And so, I started really in the middle of the pandemic. So I actually moved to Chicago in May of last year during, the pandemic. And so it was a little strange, especially because a lot of the work, like I said, we're trying to do is more hands-on, more object-based. It's meant to be, more a closer collaboration with conservators and curators and, museum staff inside of galleries and museum space. And having to now shift gears, I guess this is a true reflection of what it means to be a scientist, is to just, oh, that didn't work. I have to
adaptability.
Yeah. To be more adaptable, be more flexible. So we've shifted a lot to more fundamental questions that hopefully will have a lot of value for the broader concerns of conservators and such. But in terms of broadly speaking across both opportunities, both positions, I've had the chance to meet with so many different types of people, so many people with different backgrounds, which I think has been very helpful for me because, there's a lot that goes into a museum display, which is not something that I myself appreciated as much on the other side. And I enjoy the conversations, the levels of, the layers of intellect around an object, which again, I had not appreciated before starting. Yeah. Pretty much it.
I think there's, again, so many gems, because I would say one of the things and it seems as if you sort of alluded to that as well, that 2020, because we as scientists, we couldn't be in the lab, we couldn't be present with whatever it is we do, and so I actually think a lot of people, and maybe, okay, let me speak for myself, I can't speak for a lot of people, but speak for myself, that absence of interaction with the lab, the chemicals and things like that, forced one to really reflect on the questions of my research, and as you said, like going back to the fundamentals, and in a way, in some cases, maybe pivoting just completely and say, actually, when you have that moment to pause and just see everything in front of you and not be quote unquote distracted by, I can just go in and do X, Y, and Z. You have to look at everything in front of you. And I think it's been an opportunity to make sure that we are going deeper into the questions that we're trying to answer and making sure we're answering those, well, we're understanding the right questions and really digging deep to the topic, into the field. I don't know if that resonates with you as well.
That does. And I think, I cannot even begin to imagine what it's like to be a graduate student at this point in time, especially when your work requires you to be in the lab more hands-on. But I do, like you said, it's really the chance to take stock of what you have. And I think especially as a grad student, I was always in the mentality of like, go, 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 go. Let me just get more research, more data. And it's like, I never really stopped to think, do I really need this? Or should I focus this way? Or would the story be more, would it be stronger if I went this other direction or dove deeper into the mechanism, or, just really focused more. And I think hopefully it's, been beneficial for people in some way. I mean, I hope to say that it's not been a year lost, but I think that, yeah, for me, I can definitely relate, to your experience.
Yeah. And that transition between, so I find the postdoc experience really interesting. And I always like talking to other people about their postdoc journey, because for me, I think PhD, and you've highlighted it as well, it was very much get the data. I must get this thing. I must get this PhD. And postdoc is just a very different headspace, but also sometimes referred to as no man's land, where you're just kind of in between. You don't have anything to work towards, in the sense of you're not trying to obtain your PhD, you're not trying to obtain this thing. So you could just sit and enjoy the research, but it's also a job. So in theory, it shouldn't be so all consuming. And I say in theory because anybody who does any form of research knows that you can't switch off. Yes, you may want to go to bed at 10:30, but oops, you've had an idea and it's really hard to switch off. So what do you feel, or you are learning or have learned even in your first postdoc, what do you think that you've learned or are learning in your postdocs that you don't think you could have learned during your PhD?
Well, for one, I'm learning about art, which is not something I, had taken a serious, art historical journey through. So there are some people who are in this position or in this field who have very incredibly strong backgrounds in art history. And I think that's actually a very valuable skill. And that's something I wish I had done more of before the transition. But I think there's room for me to learn here. In any case, I think I have had a lot of support in the journey so far. So because I've had now 2 positions, one in a museum setting and one in an academic setting, I think it's actually been, very, good for me to have both views. I will say across both, I've actually learned a lot more about the analytical techniques than I did in grad school, mainly because in grad school, I had, a system that was reliable. I knew I was going to make synthetic cellular membranes. They were going to happen. This process was proven. And I didn't have to really think as much on the fly about how to make things work. Whereas when I'm working with different objects of, different origins, maybe they're made with metal, maybe they're ceramics, maybe it's glass or paper, you have to think about, okay, how do I handle this thing? How do I deal with the fact that this thing may charge in the chamber, or maybe they'll burn under the intense, laser power, and not things I would have thought about. So I've had to really think, use some mental gymnastics to really make sure that I'm isolating or identifying the best ways to handle things. And I'll say that I think I was uniquely suited for this position or this transition and this, the position where I'm collaborating so extensively with different people, because my work with the Center for Sustainable Nanotechnology was the institutional effort. And we had scientists from almost every flavor, right? So it's not only analytical chemists or physical chemists, we have people who are doing computational chemistry, we have biologists, we have environmental scientists. So we had so many different types of people. We had to learn to communicate. And that's helped me in thinking about how to talk to conservators or curators, or even more public facing, positions where I'm talking with parents or students or people in the galleries. Yes, I lost track of your question, but I've learned a lot.
No, it sounds like a really amazing journey, and being able to be in such a multidisciplinary environment. And then with your I guess I was going to say outreach, but when you're disseminating information, it could be to your colleagues, it could be to, a child who's like, oh, what does this do? And just the I guess the breadth of people that you can engage with is quite fascinating. You talked about that you've had experience in academia, you've now had experience in this museum setting. So I'm going to be very, very blunt. Do you plan on, I would say staying, but now I understand you're not sort of in that academic environment. So do you actually, let me reframe that question. Where do you think you're going to end up next? The worst question to ask somebody in their postdoc. I'm so sorry it's happening. I've got you for another few minutes. I'm going to ask, where are you going? What's the plan?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think at the moment, I do want to end up back in the museum side of things. I really did enjoy that experience. And I think that we can learn a lot about chemistry and art and such outside the classroom. I don't really feel like I need to be in the classroom. I think I haven't written it off if I'll stay in academia, but I'm leaning towards not staying. I don't have a really good answer for why, but
I mean, I actually don't like it when people ask those questions, because I think you can never know. But I just thought I'm going to use this opportunity to ask, because it ties on to this debate about academia versus, I say industry, or non-academia versus non-academic routes. And it's a constant debate that just people feeling like if they decide to stay in academia, it's going to be horrible because of, this is in a very broad sense, horrible because of the politics in academia that people perceive. If they leave academia, there's this feeling of quote unquote like they failed, which I just think is ridiculous, and I hate that that's a narrative. But do you have, just before we go on to a couple more questions, do you have any thoughts on that?
So this thought on what the debate between academia and industry.
Yeah,
I have strong feelings actually.
There we go.
I think that is one of the worst binary views that we can impose on grad students in general. I think it creates sort of, like you said, like, you know, talking about this disappointment or failure. I think it creates that sense of, okay, I would make another choice that's better for me, or where I see that I'm most needed or most valuable, but it doesn't fall into industry and academia, then I am somehow flawed. And I think as long as we are training students to do either or in terms of industry and academia, we are failing them, and we're under preparing them for the many ways that they can be chemists and scientists. And I mean, I think to be realistic, you know, there are only so many jobs, right? If you only train them to do these two things, where do you leave the ones that, you know, didn't see that as a future for themselves? And I think, you know, I'll say universities are doing a lot for their students, but I definitely think there are some concrete ways that they could improve avenues to other careers that are not, you know.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I think it's a very bad narrative, and I do think though that part of that narrative, I don't know if you have this in America, but we have these doctoral training centers in the UK, so where it would be an academic institute with various different companies, industrial companies, something like that. So we have a lot of that, and we're having a lot more of those sort of setups. So you could have somebody doing a PhD that's just funded by whoever, a government council, research council, or it's with this kind of doctoral training center with other industry companies that are invested, and there is this sort of increasing narrative of, if you're doing a PhD, is it industry funded or supported? Because, oh, that could be the career path you want to go to. And I think I learned more about the options for career with a B when I was job hunting and realizing that it's not so easy to get a job after you've got your PhD. And sorry to disappoint anybody who's listening, but it's a very weird experience where you're like, ooh, I've got my degree, I've changed my bank card to doctor, I feel amazing. And then you're like, but this doctor can't get a job.
Nobody tells you that.
It's interesting, it translates as well.
Yeah, no, you go to grad school and you say, okay, I'm, you know, opening up some more doors, but then you don't really consider the fact that you're closing a lot of doors as well.
Exactly.
You know, something to definitely consider for the audience. Yeah, like you said, think about it.
Yeah, and I think also there's that thing of realizing, like I in fact I was giving somebody advice recently, which is, you know, unfortunately, and I don't know if unfortunately is the right word, but I'm going to leave it, because unfortunately you get your PhD and you feel very proud, and so you're looking for jobs that say the requirement is a PhD, but a lot of the time the jobs that, if you don't want to stay in academia because you go for a postdoc which clearly says a PhD, so the jobs where you could also look at are looking maybe for somebody with a bachelor's at a minimum, and some people with PhDs don't realize that you can apply for that as well, and it's not because you failed. You understand? It's again that going back to that failure element. I want to ask you about what have been the highs and the lows of your career so far?
I'll set this up in a sort of hopefully positive way. I'll say, first of all, that I have to acknowledge the fact that I've had a pretty strong support system through both the highs and lows of my career, which I do really owe them, you know, a great deal of thanks for that. One of the lowest moments of my career, if I'm including grad school, was just after my qualifying exam. I felt defeated, and I felt that I had not done enough critical work on myself and the project at that point, and that showed. And so, you know, I went back to the lab and wrote my addendum to my paper, and at the same time I drafted a 5-year plan of what's going to happen for me, what are the goals I have, because at that point I honestly wanted to quit. I wasn't sure that I was in the right place. I was really suffering from this sort of imposter syndrome, you know, and I just needed to take a minute to reflect. And so that's how I started the 25 book, you know, checklist, and travel and saving money and learning how to swim, which is the only thing I didn't actually accomplish. But, you know, I did everything else on my sort of vision board, my checklist. And then I applied for a public speaking course, which is something I thought that I really needed at that moment, because I didn't feel that I communicated myself, you know, well enough, and I needed to build that skill. And so that's something I did. That was one of the lows, but I really tried to make it a learning opportunity for myself. And then the highest moment, let's see. Oh yeah. Okay. So now, literally, when I explain my research to my family, they get it. That's one of the highest things. My family could not understand what I was talking about before, no matter what language I used. I think there was a wall. But no, really, I think getting the fellowships at the Met, like I said, I really didn't think I would get it. And I think that it was a mutual leap of faith for the both of us, me and an institution. And yeah, I think that's probably one of the highest things. And that, and being invited to do a career talk at Spelman College, which
amazing.
I had never considered to be a thing. I mean, why would someone want to hear about my career? It turns out
everyone wants to hear. It's amazing. Yeah. No, that's really amazing. And I really like how you turned the low around to a high. Imposter syndrome is just like put somebody with a PhD and then put this imposter syndrome equals. is fascinating. And I think what I've been fascinated by just in our conversation is how much synergy there is. And I know it might sound really silly, but because you're in a different country, but it's just so interesting that they're just so the same commonalities, and it's weird that, even when I was talking about the bank card thing and the lack of, it's the same thing in the UK, it's the same in America, just those challenges.
Things will change.
It's fascinating. So yeah, we've come to the concluding part of the episode. If I struggle with this part, maybe I have to consider why I struggle with saying goodbye, but every time it comes to this stage of the interview, I'm always like, well, I guess I've got to let you go. So I just
say as long as you'd like.
Thanks. Don't say that, because I'll be like, so next week, are you ready? Okay, so to conclude, question number 1, what does being a chemist mean to you? And do you identify as a chemist? Actually, I assumed you did.
I do. I think I'll stick with that. It seems the most appropriate, but yeah, ask me in like a few years, it may change. For me, what it means to be a chemist is to never stop questioning or wondering. I think that's been one of, the things I've held onto in my life, even as a child, is wondering why, how, tell me what's happening here. And I think for me, in terms of what it means to me, the significance of being a chemist to me is that when I tell people or talk to people about chemistry, I can see, that light in them. I can see that they're excited or amped up about science, which for some people, you talk to them and, they'll say, oh, I didn't have a great experience with my chemistry teacher in school. And, it really turns them off. And I don't like to see that. I really want to undo that sort of damage or trauma from that experience. And I really, really enjoy engaging with people and articulating to them how science has impacted their life and how, special and magical it can be. And I think part of the reason I made this transition into the museum world, I sort of alluded to earlier, is because I think it is a natural place to discuss this intersection of science and life. And it's really, really, again, helpful to have this visual representation of, both culture and something that's culturally significant, but also understand that it's also scientifically interesting or important as well. And I think it's a unique position to explore. So that it means a lot to me, more so because I know what I can represent and the work that I do represent to other people. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. And so what would you say, out of everything we've spoken about today, what would be your take-home messages?
Take-home messages. Let's see. So just before this call, I actually talked to my granddad on a spur of the moment conversation. And he reminded me of something that I'd actually been thinking about before this. But he told me about my grandmother who passed away when I was younger. But he told me she'd say, this too shall pass. And if it doesn't pass or there's a wall in my way, I'm going to knock it down, which is the sort of philosophy that I had embraced as to, when you don't see a way, make a way, right? It's something that you can apply to existential problems, but also day-to-day lab activities. It's, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. I think it reflects my journey. I did not know where I was going. I knew that there were things I wanted to do, and there's no clear path to do it, but I'm going to find a way to do it anyway. And so, yeah, it's something I think is important to keep in mind. Second one, let's see. When it's meant for you, all of the universe will conspire in helping you to achieve it. So this is a modification of a quote from the alchemist. And I think, this reflects my life. I have sort of lived in this way of allowing the universe to guide me in what is meant for me. I think it helps me to relieve stress on myself of trying to figure out, is this the right thing to do? Am I doing the best thing for myself? Is it the right answer? I'll never know. And I can't beat myself up trying to figure it out. So I sort of, let it go, and hopefully universe will guide me through. Yeah. And the last will be just, on rough days, just, take a minute to reflect, take stock, figure out a plan, and that will help you to get through those next steps. Nothing is going to last forever. No moment is going to last forever.
You've been listening to the Monday Science Podcast, a weekly show bringing you the latest research and news in science, technology, medicine, and health. We hope you've gotten some useful and thought-provoking info from the show, and we hope you had fun along the way. We know we did. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hook up with us on our website at www.mondaysciencepodcast.com. Shoot us an email at info@mondaysciencepodcast.com. Find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Monday Science, and access episode summaries at mondayscience.medium.com. See you next week on the Monday Science Podcast.